I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to, because when someone is standing in your doorway holding a master key they weren't invited to use, volume isn't the weapon, certainty is, and that's exactly what I was holding on to when Brenda Holt stepped one foot into my house like she owned the place. Chin up, clipboard tucked against her arm, that HOA badge catching the light like it was supposed to mean something sacred. "You don't need to block the hallway, Mr. Calder," she said, calm, clipped, practiced, the way people sound when they've said the same sentence 100 times and never once been told no. "The association has emergency access authority." I planted myself in front of the bathroom door, felt the cool of the tile through my shoes, felt my heart thudding somewhere behind my ribs, and said the one sentence I knew would stop her cold. "My niece is in there, and if you touch that handle, I'm filing a formal report with timestamps." She blinked, just once, not fear exactly, more like recalculation, the look someone gets when they realize they've pushed 1 inch past where the rules actually protect them. And if you've ever wanted to see someone who lives off technicalities run straight into the consequences of their own system, stay with me, because this didn't turn into a shouting match. It turned into something much quieter, much worse for her. What Brenda didn't know, standing there in my entryway pretending this was just another compliance sweep, was that I'd helped design the back-end audit logic for the access firmware her third-party vendor used. She didn't know that every key fob issued to board officers logged unlock requests down to the millisecond, or that those logs didn't just say when a door opened. They said who authorized it, under what tier, and whether that action violated state-level unauthorized entry statutes. I knew, though, and I'd learned a long time ago never to skip logging my own systems, especially not after my niece Lily moved in. Brenda smoothed her blazer, gave me one last look like she was filing me away as a future problem, muttered something about non-compliant citations, and left, heels clicking down the walkway, gate creaking once before the silence settled back in. I stood there longer than I needed to, listening, waiting, because when someone tries to open a door they don't belong behind, the sound of them leaving matters. "My name's Aaron Calder. I work in compliance analytics, the kind of job where you spend your days figuring out how systems fail quietly, how people misuse authority without triggering alarms. And in Cedar Ridge Estates, I'm mostly known as the guy in the blue-gray house with the overgrown rosemary bush who never shows up to HOA meetings." I didn't used to care, honestly. Repaint the trim, adjust the mailbox, remove a wind chime they decided was visually inconsistent. Fine, whatever. I complied, because those were annoyances, not invasions. This was different, because that bathroom, the one Brenda thought she could access under some vague emergency clause, that was Lily's refuge. She's 14, soft-spoken, still carrying the kind of grief that makes kids shrink inward. She came to live with me after my sister passed the year before, and the only place she ever really felt safe when the world got too loud was that guest bathroom with the seashell shower curtain and the dusty skylight that let in just enough light to feel like breathing. That door wasn't just wood and hinges. It was a boundary she trusted, and Brenda almost crossed it. Cedar Ridge's HOA isn't unique, but it's aggressive, the kind of board that confuses order with control, and Brenda Holt had been president for 6 years by then, long enough to rewrite enforcement language, expand emergency definitions, and justify surprise inspections with wording so elastic it could snap around any door she wanted. She hid behind policy, but what she actually loved was leverage, the feeling of being able to walk anywhere, anytime, because a laminated badge said she could. I'd let it slide until that morning, because power only feels abstract until it's standing between you and someone you're responsible for. At the end of our hallway there's a mirror in an old oak frame my sister picked out when she bought the house. Lily stands in front of it some mornings before school, trying to look normal, trying to remember who she was before everything fell apart, and Brenda tried to walk past it like it was just another corridor on a checklist. I want you to picture that for a second, a grown woman with a master key, convinced the rules bend for her, stepping toward a locked bathroom where a grieving teenager thinks she's alone, and ask yourself what you do, because I promise you, that question doesn't leave once it's planted. The next morning, I didn't go to work. I went to the Cedar Ridge Community Center, where the HOA held their monthly compliance review, the one most residents treated like bad weather, inevitable and unpleasant, something you waited out without making eye contact. I wasn't there to argue. I was there to observe. Brenda stood at the front with her clipboard, polished smile in place. While an elderly couple, the Millers, approached with an appeal, their granddaughter had painted a small mural on their back gate, technically not visible from the street, but the HOA cited it anyway. Brenda barely looked at the photo. Policy applies to all exterior surfaces, she said, checking a box. You'll need to remove it. It's therapy, Mrs. Miller said softly. She lost her dad last year. Brenda didn't blink. The rules apply equally. That's how control works. It hides behind fairness. I stood near the back, phone recording silently, not for drama, not for revenge, but because patterns matter, and she was handing me one line by line. When the meeting shifted to a quick update on the new smart locks issued to board officers, one of the members joked about residents forgetting to lock their doors and blaming the HOA. The room laughed, but I watched the treasurer, a guy named Mark Ellis, stiffen just slightly, his hand lingering on the railing as Brenda locked up afterward, his eyes following her like he knew something he wasn't ready to say. Brenda walked past me without a glance, already convinced the incident at my house was over, that I'd grumble, comply, forget, just like everyone else. I didn't forget, because Lily skipped breakfast that morning, wouldn't meet my eyes, and when a kid starts doubting the safety of their own space, that's not grief anymore, that's fear settling in. According to standard procedure, I didn't confront Brenda again. I didn't escalate publicly. I let her keep doing exactly what she'd been doing for years, because people who abuse power rely on routine, and routine leaves tracks. By the end of that week, I wasn't just another resident anymore. I was mapping access times, usage windows, override patterns, quietly turning Cedar Ridge into a case file, and Brenda Holt had no idea the system she thought protected her was about to do the opposite. All right, pause the story right here for a second, because this is the part most people miss when they hear something like this and think, wow, what a crazy HOA, when in reality, this kind of thing happens way more often than anyone wants to admit. According to standard procedure, HOA emergency access rights are supposed to be extremely narrow. They exist for fires, floods, welfare checks that have been called in by a third party, things where waiting would clearly cause harm, not vague inspections, not curiosity, not control disguised as compliance. From a legal perspective, the moment an HOA officer uses a master key without a documented emergency trigger, they're no longer enforcing rules. They're risking unauthorized entry, and in many states, that crosses from civil violation into criminal exposure real fast. And here's the psychological layer people underestimate. This is a psychological trap, because when authority figures normalize small intrusions, repaint this, move that, unlock this, just for a second, residents slowly stop questioning behavior that would be outrageous coming from anyone else. Power like Brenda's thrives on silence and routine, on people assuming someone else must have checked the rules, someone else must have approved it, when in reality no one did. The lesson here is simple but uncomfortable. Systems don't protect you by default. They protect whoever understands them best. And when someone starts treating your private space like a shared resource, that's not order. That's entitlement wearing a badge. When I say I let Brenda keep going, I don't mean I sat back and hoped she'd trip over her own ego. I mean I watched her the way you watch a storm on radar. Not because you're impressed by it, but because you want to know exactly where it's going to hit. By Tuesday afternoon, I had enough metadata to be dangerous, but not enough to end it, which is the worst place to be, because you can see the truth clearly, but you're still missing the one thing no amount of data can replace, someone on the inside willing to confirm it. The HOA board met every Wednesday evening in a glass-walled conference room behind the leasing office, technically private, practically visible if you knew where to stand. And that night, I positioned myself in the hallway with a clipboard and the kind of posture that says I belong, even when I don't. Through the blinds, I could see Brenda at the head of the table, back straight, pen tapping against a legal pad she never actually looked at, flanked by board members who'd long ago learned that nodding was easier than questioning. Mark Ellis, the treasurer, sat 2 seats down from her, hands folded too tightly, jaw clenched like he was bracing for impact. And when Brenda joked about residents overreacting to access protocols, everyone chuckled except him. He stared at the table, eyes unfocused, the look of someone who knows a line has been crossed but hasn't decided whether he's brave enough to say it out loud. I didn't need to hear every word. I just needed to watch who flinched, and Mark flinched every time emergency access came up. When the meeting broke, Brenda walked out already on her phone, voice clipped, performative, the sound of someone managing optics, not truth, and Mark lingered behind just long enough for our eyes to meet. I nodded once, nothing dramatic, no confrontation, just acknowledgement, and he didn't nod back, but he didn't look away either. That was enough to tell me the silence had weight. That night, back in my home office, I laid everything out, the access logs, the firmware behavior, the timestamps lining up with motion sensors that didn't record video out of respect for privacy, but absolutely recorded movement. And there it was, clear as day. A Tier 3 manual unlock at 5:42 p.m., my front door, Brenda's key fob ID, no emergency flag, no override justification, just raw access. One entry became 2, then 7, different addresses, different days, some after dark, all without proper triggers. This wasn't inspection, this was probing. And when you see that pattern emerge, the air changes, because now you're not dealing with a rule breaker, you're dealing with someone who thinks private space is optional. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from the HOA's legal liaison, warning me about unauthorized recordings and potential civil liability. And I almost laughed, because that message told me more than any spreadsheet ever could. Brenda wasn't worried I was wrong. She was worried I was right. And people don't threaten you legally unless they feel the ground shifting under their feet. By Friday, I was sitting on a bench near the community mailbox cluster when Brenda showed up right on schedule, navy windbreaker zipped, HOA crest stitched over her heart like armor. She pulled a thick envelope from the board's box, flipped through it, glanced around, and tossed a couple of pages into the recycling bin like they were junk mail. I waited until she disappeared down the path before walking over, heart steady, breath even, because panic makes mistakes, and this wasn't the moment for mistakes. On top of old flyers and takeout menus sat a document I recognized instantly, a draft access activity summary from the vendor portal, unofficial, incomplete, but real. The timestamps matched my logs perfectly, including the unlock at my house, Tier 3, verification field blank. 6 other addresses, same story. This wasn't speculation anymore, it was proof. And proof has a gravity all its own. I photographed everything, angles wide enough to show context, scuffs on the bin lid, the position of the papers, chain of custody details people think don't matter until they suddenly matter a lot. I put the pages back exactly where I found them and walked home the long way, feeling the neighborhood differently now, like I was seeing the skeleton beneath the skin. That evening, Lily sat curled up on the couch sketching, headphones on, pencil moving in slow, careful lines, and I didn't interrupt her. I just sat across the room and kept building the report, stitching logs and documents together until it stopped looking like suspicion and started looking like a case. Still, it wasn't enough, because from a legal perspective, data without corroboration is vulnerable, and Brenda was the kind of person who'd try to bury this in procedural mud. That's when I sent Mark a message, short, encrypted, no accusations, just the truth laid out plainly. You know what you saw. If you're ready to talk, I'm listening. 2 days passed with no response. And then Sunday morning, while I was raking leaves I wasn't really paying attention to, my phone buzzed. Back patio, 10 minutes, no phones. I left mine in the car and walked the 3 streets to his house, the kind of place that looks like it's never broken a rule in its life. Mark sat at the patio table nursing a drink, tie loosened, eyes tired, and when I asked him how many homes she'd accessed, he stared at the table and said, at least 11, like he was confessing a sin. He told me she'd asked him to disable the firmware threshold that locked out repeated emergency entries, said she needed flexibility, told him not to log the change, and that was the moment the last piece clicked into place. This wasn't negligence, it was deliberate. From a legal perspective, that shifted everything. He agreed to validate the logs and provide the internal notes, not publicly, not yet, but enough to anchor the data in human testimony. The next 48 hours were a blur of verification, third-party confirmation, hash signatures, and quiet favors called in from people who understood exactly how serious this was. By the time I finished, the report was airtight, 70 pages of nothing but facts, timestamps, firmware behavior, policy contradictions, no adjectives, no emotion, just truth stacked so neatly it couldn't fall over. Monday morning, I sent it out, one version to the vendor, one to law enforcement, one to the board, and then I waited. The special meeting was called 2 days later, the community room packed with residents who could feel something was wrong even if they didn't know what yet. Brenda opened with her usual calm assurance, talking about procedural reviews and resident misunderstandings, and then I stepped forward. I didn't yell, I didn't insult her, I just stated facts. The number of accesses, the lack of emergency flags, the firmware overrides, the unlocked door while my niece was inside. You could feel the room shift, whispers turning into murmurs, faces tightening as people replayed moments they'd brushed off before. When Mark stood up and confirmed it, voice steady despite everything, the air went dead quiet, because once the silence breaks, it doesn't go back together the same way. People started speaking up, small stories, side gates opened, patios entered without notice, things they dismissed as mistakes suddenly forming a pattern, and Brenda, for the first time since I'd met her, looked genuinely cornered. She tried to adjourn the meeting, but it was too late. The truth had momentum now, and when the detective walked in, badge finally visible, there was no drama left to manage. Brenda left without a word, and the room exhaled like it had been holding its breath for years. I closed my laptop, not because I was done, but because the system had finally done what it was supposed to do: expose misuse, protect the vulnerable, and remind everyone that authority without accountability is an order. It's just trespassing with better stationery. After everything settled, after the emails stopped coming in waves and the board voted to suspend Brenda pending the investigation, after the vendor announced a full audit and law enforcement confirmed they were treating this as unauthorized entry, I expected to feel victorious, or at least relieved in a dramatic way, but that's not what showed up. What I felt instead was quiet, the kind that comes after a long, sustained tension finally releases, and that quiet gave me space to think about what actually happened here beyond one overreaching HOA president. The lesson here is not that Brenda was uniquely evil or that Cedar Ridge was uniquely broken. It's that systems like this are designed to function on autopilot. And autopilot works great right up until someone decides the rules are suggestions and no one checks behind them. From a legal perspective, most homeowners don't realize how thin the line is between emergency access and unlawful entry, because HOA language is often written to sound absolute, while actually being conditional. And the moment a board member starts treating private homes like shared assets, the risk isn't just fines or lawsuits, it's trust collapsing. According to standard procedure, safeguards exist not to slow things down, but to force accountability, and when someone disables those safeguards, even for convenience, they're telling you exactly how they see their role: above scrutiny, above residents, above consequences. This is a psychological trap too, because people like Brenda don't usually storm and yelling. They normalize, they smile, they cite policy, they make you feel silly for questioning them, and over time, that erodes your sense of ownership over your own space. The moment you start thinking, well, I guess they're allowed to do that, without ever seeing proof, you've already handed over ground you didn't mean to. I think about Lily a lot when I think about this case, not because she was the loudest voice or the most visible victim, but because she represents the people these systems are supposed to protect and so often don't: the quiet ones, the ones who assume adults and institutions will do the right thing without being watched. What changed the outcome here wasn't anger, it wasn't confrontation, it was understanding how the system actually worked and refusing to let silence cover misuse. That's the part one want people to sit with, because you don't have to be a compliance analyst to apply this mindset. You just have to be willing to ask uncomfortable questions and document the answers. If you live under an HOA, learn where their authority actually ends. Ask how emergency access is defined. Ask what oversight exists. Ask who audits the auditors. Because according to standard procedure, transparency isn't optional, it's foundational. And if you ever find yourself feeling small for pushing back, remember that authority only feels absolute when no one challenges it with facts. This story didn't end with someone getting dragged away in handcuffs or a viral confrontation clip. It ended with locks meaning what they're supposed to mean again, with a kid closing a door without flinching, with neighbors realizing they weren't crazy for feeling watched. That matters more than spectacle. So here's what I want to hear from you, not because it helps the algorithm, but because these conversations matter. Have you ever had an HOA, a landlord, or an institution cross a line and make you question whether your home was really yours. Did you push back, or did you freeze because you didn't know where to start? Share your experience in the comments, or if you're not ready for that, just drop where you're watching from. Because the more we talk about how power gets misused in ordinary places, the harder it becomes for anyone to hide behind policy and pretend they're untouchable.